Hello, Internet. Daniel with Driving and Dragons, and I'm going to do a quick reaction now to Jenny D. I did a reaction to OGGM's reply to her and said that there's some stuff that I agree with her on, um, and I understand the business model and the business that she's in, but she is very much a fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons product. That's just what she is. Um, and she is packaged to sell to the fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons community. Not even really the tabletop role playing game community, but predominantly the fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons community, and then the communities that are ancillary to cosplay. But she's talking about how great GMs make a character's backstory matter. And let's see what I agree with on here, because when it comes to things like character backstory and general GM narrative tips, there's not really going to be a massive difference whether you're doing it in first edition, second edition, third edition, cyberpunk, fifth edition, Call of Cthulhu, Traveler, Gamma World. Doesn't really matter. Narratively, good narrative is good narrative. And even though there are a lot of tendencies within the fifth edition community that I think mar those narratives, doesn't mean there's not good advice. So let's have a look and see what she has to say.
Hey friends, Ginny D here, and about a year ago I was making a video and I asked D&D players to name one thing they wished their DM did. Out of hundreds of responses, one that came up over and over was players wishing their DMs would do something with their backstory. And it makes sense. One of the things that makes tabletop games special is that they're collaborative. Players aren't just there to be an audience for the DM's story, they're there to shape it. But while the game master controls every single other part of the world, all players have is their character. That's their contribution to the story. Now, of course, not every D&D player even wants to have or use their backstory. So if you have players who just don't care about this, then obviously this is not for you.
Yeah, there is a large section, particularly in the OSR, that this really doesn't apply to. I would even go so far as to say that a lot of times, my Dungeons and Dragons experience is predominantly third and 3.5. That's really where I was most active. That's what I know the best. That's what I've run the most games in as far as Dungeons and Dragons is concerned. And it's my favorite Dungeons and Dragons system. But I'll tell you, if you did a pie chart of like the percentage of players who care more about their game rules build and how they put things together and less about backstory or story, period, all they really want to know is if the 15 different little things that they need to make their character have that additional +2 damage that puts them at the top tier are going to work in your game, then yeah, I mean, definitely this would not be for them.
If a player takes the time and effort to create a backstory and then it never really comes up, it can feel like that contribution isn't being honored. And if you don't care about their characters, then why should they care about your game? So that's an easy solution. Just use their backstories, right? Unfortunately, it isn't quite that simple, because if you handle character backstories in the wrong way, it could be even worse than not doing it at all. So let's
Yeah, that's 100% correct. Because that was one thing I was about to say is, not honoring that backstory. A lot of times your characters turn over these backstories that just are not in any way compatible with what's been put forward by the game master as what is going to be played at that table. And if I'm coming in and I'm saying, hey, this is a war-torn land, it's kind of a gritty, we'll say, post-Roman Britain, Dark Age, Arthurian, Saxon invasion kind of feel to it. It's kind of a lower magic situation. And somebody hands me like a 4-page backstory that's rife with bad high fantasy tropes ripped straight from Forgotten Realms. And they're playing something that they begged and cajoled to get me to even allow in the game, with 14 different fairy types and other crap that's involved in it that just really doesn't fit with the theme and atmosphere that's being put forth, then you kind of have to say, hey, look, I appreciate you wrote up your 10-page backstory here, but none of your crap's making it into the game, because you're going to derail the entire atmosphere that we're going for. Or, a more classic example people know is like, you got that guy who makes the joke character. It's like, dude, you made a joke character that's not appropriate to the theme of the game that we're playing. So you can't expect it. And if the DM actually capitulated and brought that nonsense backstory in, all it does is kill the fun for the rest of the table.
Let's talk about how you can make your players feel like their characters are a meaningful part of your shared story. There are a lot of ways to use player backstory. I think we can loosely divide it into 3 different approaches, or intensities. The lowest intensity is what I call the I read your backstory approach. This method is basically the bare minimum of recognizing your player's input. You can just take anything from their character history and have it appear in the game. It doesn't have to be important, it doesn't have to be plot relevant, it just has to come up. Maybe the party visits or even just hears about a location from one of the party members' past, or a character receives a letter from a friend or family member, or meets an NPC that they have history with. In this approach, backstory elements are more like Easter eggs. They give players an opportunity to go, hey, that's me, that's my thing, without having a major impact on the game. This style might be enough for parties who aren't particularly passionate about their backstories, or for short-term games that don't allow a lot of room for personal tie-ins. Or you can use the I read your backstory approach as a first step to feel out which parts of a character's history they want to engage with. If a character runs into an old mentor and doesn't seem that interested in catching up, then you can just move on. But if they start asking a ton of questions or suggest that they stay in touch or meet again, that might indicate that the player is interested in deepening that plotline. If you want to take it a little deeper, you can try what I call the ensemble.
Okay. Going on the what you just said. That is, in a lot of ways, the way you handle a backstory that really just doesn't fit into the overall theme that you're going for in your game. Because what's really important is, it is important to make players feel like their characters matter, to feel like it's a lived-in world, and to feel like that their life matters to what you've got going on. But at the end of the day, the game master is the final arbiter, and is even more so the final arbiter of the narrative. The theme and the atmosphere and the direction and the overall emotional push of the story is the responsibility of the game master, and it is a dereliction of that responsibility if you're doing something that derails that. And that includes trying to include something that is farcical from somebody's backstory, or something that's inappropriate, or something that doesn't necessarily fit. Like, for instance, something that is taking the opposite approach. You're running a more lighthearted game, and somebody's got this edgelord dark backstory. We don't need to bring in his, child slave captor in the into the more lighthearted game. But what you can do is, you can, like she said, bring up something, mention it in, just sprinkle it in to help add some flavor into your world. And one thing that's very important here too is that lies on the players too. It is not just the game master's responsibility to bring their backstory into the game. It's also the player's responsibility. Your player needs to be doing things like, hey, I want to send a letter, or I want to use, depending on how prevalent the magic in your world is, like, I want to use a spell or visit the local wizard's tower or something to check on my sister who has incurable disease that I am adventuring to find the cure for. You don't have to wait on the GM to bring it up. But yes, sometimes that is all that's needed. And in a lot of times, that's kind of what needs to happen anyway, because you're going to have some situations where the backstory element isn't really useful to you until later in the game. And when I say later in the game, I mean you're running a campaign that's designed to go from 1st to 15th level, and this particular backstory element that really fits and is really useful isn't even going to really start showing up until like 7th, 8th level. You might want to throw a couple of bones to that player with a few of those little kind of offhand mentions early into the game.
cast approach. In television or film, an ensemble cast is when there are multiple main characters rather than a single protagonist. For example, The Avengers, The Office, and Lost all feature ensemble casts. And one thing you'll notice in episodic ensemble cast productions is that every once in a while, there will be an episode or a short arc that is particularly focused on a single character. In Futurama, for example, there's a whole episode where Dr. Zoidberg returns to his home planet to find a mate. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, there's an episode centered on Sokka training in swordsmanship with a Fire Nation teacher. Even though the full ensemble is usually present and on screen in episodes like this, the story is focused temporarily on one character before returning to a collective story. You can do this in your D&D game too, by incorporating side quests or sessions that engage with one player's backstory without necessarily becoming a major part of the overall plot. You basically give each player a chance to be the main character for a day. This is a relatively lightweight way to involve your players' backstories in the game, because you don't have to find a way to relate their history to the larger arc. You can just
Okay, this is, and I know that she's given out some more general advice here. This isn't anything spectacular. This isn't anything world breaking or groundbreaking. This isn't anything new. This is basic of the most basic game master behavior, to the point that it's even mentioned in things like Dungeon Master's guides. I believe some of the older ones. I don't know about 5th edition. And it's in the Cyberpunk Red Handbook. It's in the Cyberpunk 2020 Game Core Rule Book. This is super basic game master behavior. You need to have some focus on each individual character from time to time, because each character needs to have some focus and spotlight if you want to keep your table together.
find an opening or a hook in each character's past and extrapolate it into a short quest. This can also have the added benefit of giving the whole party a little variety and a short break from whatever intense world-ending problem they're facing. To make this even easier, you can leave the decision-making to your players. You can literally just ask them what they want to pursue for their character-focused side quest. Is there a mystery they want to solve or a task they want to complete?
I generally disagree with this. You might have some collaboration with an individual player. Say you got 4 or 5 things that just really stand out because that player just happened to hit all the best details or something, or all the best little ticks. Yeah, that might be something where you want to say, hey, I'm thinking about doing one of these 2 things. Let me get some more detail that, which one of these would be better for you. But as a general rule of thumb, I don't really think that's a good way to run your games. If you're trying to run narrative games, you need to be able to tie things together and tie them into your bigger picture. And when you go in and you just say, hey, which one of these backstory elements do you really want to do? And you're doing that with the multiple characters, you're going to start chopping up your narrative. Now, if you're playing more episodic games and you're not serializing that much, you're not running big overarching campaigns, you're really running what is essentially a series of one-shots with the same characters, this is not near as bad. It's a lot more permissible. A lot of that's going to depend on your table. But as a general rule of thumb, going to your players and saying, hey, what do you want to track down? Outside of a pre-session 0, hey, what kind of themes are you guys looking for? What kind of game do you want to run? Which is really, really 1,000-yard view when a backstory element is more 100-yard view. Just not something that I personally would recommend. But again, whatever works for your table.
Or vengeance they want to take. They don't need to write the whole quest, but you can absolutely ask them to give you a prompt. The last approach is the highest intensity, and for some tables could be the best. We'll explore it after a brief Lord of the Rings themed break.
We will be skipping a brief Lord of the Rings themed break.
Okay, back to the most intense approach, what I call the party is the plot. In this method, your characters' backstories are the foundation on which the overall game plot is built. The goals and unfinished business of the characters become the driving force of the story. This means that not only does the DM need to find loose threads in each character's backstory to spin into a larger campaign arc, they also need to be able to tie those threads to one another. If one character is hunting the mage who kidnapped their sister, and another is following a mysterious map that they inherited from their dead parents, parents, while a third is a noble on the run after being framed for murder, it's your job to find a way to link those things. For example, maybe the map leads to an ancient lost tower that once belonged to a legendary wizard and may contain the secret to eternal life. The mage seeks the tower and knows that she can only find it with a blood sacrifice descended from the wizard, the kidnapped sister. To fund her search, the mage partnered with a power-hungry noble, but betrayed him once his usefulness ran out, pinning the murder on another. Now you have a plot that each player is explicitly connected to. They're motivated to pursue it, they have strong party cohesion over shared goals, and best of all, no matter which parts of each of their backstories they pursue, all threads lead back to the main plot. Sounds good, right? This method is undoubtedly the most difficult one to pull off.
That's kind of where I was just going. It is not only the most difficult one to pull off, it relies on all the players having a certain level of participation to have that hook, because it gets real dangerous. If you have 5 players and 3 of them give you good, solid backstory that's fleshed out that allows you to take these threads, weave them together, and make a story, and 2 phone it in or more generic or whatever the case may be, or simply put in a backstory that just really doesn't jive, you're left with 2 options: shoehorning in something that doesn't fit to try and make it work, or leaving those players out. And they will feel left out when they see 3 players clearly getting the love of having their backstory woven together and they're a big part of the campaign. And especially if you're talking about like a big campaign arc where 5 or 6 levels or so are dedicated to these 3 players' backstory being woven together, while these 2 guys over here are basically henchmen. Now, it may be kind of their fault for not putting in the extra effort or something, but it may not be. So it's something that you got to be careful with. And another thing is, this is extraordinarily labor intensive on the game master. If you are a game master who has lots of time to dedicate to, like when I was in my 20s and I was a single man who worked for himself and had hours, I could dedicate an entire weekday, several entire weekdays to writing up Dungeons and Dragons quests and stuff for my group. This wouldn't be such a big deal. But when you're a busy professional with a family and you have limited time to dedicate to it, what you're essentially doing here is you are taking the characters, you're getting these backstories generally around the same time that you're running a session 0. So you're already behind the 8 ball on preparing that campaign, unless you're going to spend the first 3 or 4 levels doing something different while you try to write this thing. That is a labor-intensive practice to do it right and make sure it's done right. And that works great for somebody whose entire life is playing games, whether they're professional game masters, whether they're game designers, whether they're YouTubers that literally make a living off of cosplaying and playing D&D and writing Dungeons and Dragons quests and that sort of thing, or a game store owner or something of that nature. It's a totally different thing for the majority of the player base who literally has limited time to do this.
Because it's very dependent on the depth and theme of the backstories that your players bring to the table. In fact, while I think this method can sound like the ultimate goal, I don't think it works for every party. I would recommend this approach for experienced DMs and players who are passionate about in-depth character roleplay. But for players who feel intimidated by long, in-depth backstories or just want to give their DM a few loose concepts and then go along for the ride, I think the ensemble cast method could be more satisfying for everyone. I feel like it's also important to note that this is not 100% on DMs. There are certain kinds of character backstories that are better suited for use in-game than others. And I do plan on making a video for players about how to create a backstory that your DM can actually use. But it takes 2 to tango, and this video is about how DMs can tango. Regardless of which approach or a combination of approaches you want to take in.
So she did touch on the idea of the backstories have to be somewhat usable from the players. Of course, she does not, or at least has not yet, touched on the concept of some of us don't have that level of time to dedicate to it. And I'm going to be frank, a lot of game masters simply don't have the creativity or vision to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's a lot who don't. And simple, basic story beats is the best thing in the world for those DMs. I really think that third thing is really, really, she is right when she says that. And she did mention that even in a lot of cases, it's not going to be what works best. But I still feel a lot of perspective coming from the position of somebody who literally plays games for a living, and is mired in this 24/7, as opposed to somebody who literally gets up and showers and goes spend 8 to 10 hours a day working, comes home, has to, sit down, have dinner, watch some TV, have conversation, sit out on the porch and have drinks, whatever, with their spouse, and then does an hour before bed to scribble about some Dungeons and Dragons 1 or 2 times a week. The other times they're reading a book or watching the last TV or just going to bed early. So they're putting 2 hours a week into their game. I don't think that third one, I don't really, to be honest, the second one is kind of bad even for them. So you got to take that advice with a serious grain of salt, because you cannot turn your hobby into a job and expect it to still be fun, unless you're literally getting paid to do it. The worst thing in the world is your hobby becomes a job that you're doing for free.
Your game, now is where I have to give you a warning. The only thing worse than ignoring character backstories is mishandling them. Like I mentioned before, DMs control pretty much everything about the game world other than the characters. So mess with your characters' backstories and you're stepping into the very limited area of the game where they actually have creative control. That means you need to step carefully. My rule of thumb is to treat anything that a player defines as set in stone and focus your exploration on the gaps in their backstory. This means that if a player says,
I'm going to let her finish on this one. I disagree with this entirely. Now, I agree with a caveat. The caveat is, if this is happening after the game has already started, then yeah, you have complicitly agreed that everything in their backstory is set in stone. Everything that's explicitly stated is set in stone once you start the game. So when you look at a character's backstory, you should review a character's backstory and have a discussion if there's things that they really might want to adjust or adapt or adopt, change or don't work in your world or something. That should happen before the first session. That should happen before the narrative starts. And I will say this, and this is a perspective I have, because like I said, excessive player agency or an obsession with player agency that goes too far beyond the gauge of agency is actually a big part of what's ruining the game and ruining the hobby, in my opinion. But your character's backstory is how your character perceives that backstory. If you're a game master and you want to change something, it might be, hey, you thought your parents were killed by this guy because that's what you saw as a child. But the twist is when you meet him, he actually was trying to save them and somebody else killed them. And now you've got a big, meaningful character thing, a character event that is truly on the messing with their backstory book, because the only thing you're granting them is that is the truth of how they perceived that event. So on the surface, I disagree with her here, but we're going to see what else she has to say.
As her twin brother mysteriously disappeared when they turned 16, you can go wild and decide that he was kidnapped by hags or ran away to become a pirate or joined a cult. But if the player says her brother joined the Kingsguard, it could be overstepping to say, well, actually, he said he was joining the Kingsguard, but instead he ran away to join a cult. And to be clear, this is a system you can communicate to your players. They can choose to define things, or they can choose to leave them open. You can check in with them about which parts of their backstory they're open to you messing with, so that you can give them fun surprises instead of unwelcome ones. You might have players who ask that you leave their character's family alone, or let their dead wife stay dead. I recently had a player whose character had amnesia, but basically told me that they weren't really interested in exploring his forgotten past. When in doubt, I will always advocate for ruining the surprise by talking with a player rather than risking making someone feel like their character is being rewritten without their consent. And even if a backstory hook isn't going to be a surprise for the player, it can still be a surprise for the rest of the party. A player and a DM keeping a juicy backstory secret together can be a lot of fun. This is where I think tools like Session Zero really make a big difference. In a Session Zero, which just means a session that happens before the game actually starts, you can ask your players about their boundaries. What kinds of topics and themes do they want to avoid in the game? I really like lines and veils for this, which is basically where you ask your player to define their lines, which are topics that they don't want to come up in the game at all, and veils, which
I completely disagree with this. Okay? 100% disagree with it. I'm not a lines and veils person. I'm not a safety tools person. As a game master who is running a game, you are running a game. Okay? You are putting a tremendous amount of effort and creativity into building a system. And you come forth and this is a place where a game master dictates. I am running a game and we will be allowing these. We will not be allowing these. If this is not something that you want to be involved with, then that's okay. You can go play somewhere else. The only exception I have to this is long-standing groups that have been together for a long time. If I'm playing with a group of people that I've been playing with for years, that are part of a solid core group of people that I go do other stuff with, that I go to movies with, and we're at each other's barbecues and stuff, and I want to do something a little crazy, yeah, I'm going to sit with them and be like, hey guys, I'm thinking of running this kind of theme. I'm thinking of maybe allowing this kind of stuff in this game. Is that something you think would be good or something you would be interested in? But no, lines and veils, we're not giving players that kind of power if they don't want to. Because the problem is when you give them lines and veils become lines and veils get moved. And usually in a way that benefits the player and manipulates the game and can derail a lot of things. This is not something that I advocate for. And in terms of Session Zero, once again, my thoughts on that. If you're doing this at Session Zero, you are doing it too late for a real world regular game master to be doing. You should be having backstory discussions, individual with your players, about what fits, what doesn't fit, what their idea and their concept for their character is and whatnot. And the discussion of, hey, this is how you perceive your backstory. Those discussions should be happening prior to a Session Zero. Because if you're doing them at Session Zero, you are heaping a tremendous amount of work on yourself, retooling your campaign, retooling your adventures right off the bat. Unless you're saying, hey, we're going to play once a month and Session Zero is 30 days away and you got plenty of time to 1 hour a week draft your game from scratch. Session Zero is too late. And I think that's actually kind of a waste of Session Zero's time. Session Zero should be introducing the characters already as they are, so they should be ready. It should be running down the list of, the hard list of do's and don'ts. Now, one of the reasons why I say lines and veils and X cards and all that crap is just not something that needs to happen in the game is I'm going to be vetting players before they're invited to my table. If I'm doing like a game where I'm picking up a group and I'm inviting people online, yeah, we're going to have a Session Zero and I'm going to say, hey, this is what I expect. This is what's okay. This is what we're going to be running. These are the overall social rules of the table. This is, house rules and all that stuff. That's what Session Zero is for. But when it comes to like, hey, I'm not going to be, I'm going to be running this type of game that may have these kinds of themes in them. I'm going to tell you that before we ever make it to a Session Zero. And you're not going to waste my Session Zero time where I'm going over house rules and maybe an overview of the game world that I've put together, or, my ideas for how we're going to progress as the campaign or how I handle character death, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to waste that precious time on things like, are you afraid of spiders? How do you feel about children getting hurt? those kind of things that should be vetted beforehand. Now, this is the big exception. I said this in my safety tools video. There's a clear exception to this. If you are running as a professional game master, if you are running at a con, if you are running an ad hoc or pickup game or something like that, starting like a sign up to play the game, I'm going to be running a game X hours at a game shop, then you have to have at least some measure of safety tools, and the lines and bales is about as far as I would go on safety tools, period, in any scenario. But you don't get an X card. You get up and go to the bathroom and come back to the table later, or address it between sessions. Get up and leave, shoot the game master a text, say, "Hey, I'm uncomfortable, and we'll address this between sessions." That's what you get. But when it comes to those kind of scenarios, then it can be kind of a session zero thing. And that's only because you're in a situation where you have to have you don't get to previously or prior vet those players.
Which are topics that can exist off screen but won't be role played or described in detail. If a player tells you that they have a line at parental death, for example, then you'll know that killing off their character's mom for a quest hook is not going to be okay. I think it's common to see these kinds of boundaries as limiting, but I would challenge you to instead see establishing boundaries as freeing. Because once you know for sure what your players are and aren't open to, then you're free to play in those open spaces without worrying about putting a foot wrong. If you want your players to feel invested in and passionate about your game, they have to feel like they've helped create it. That means collaborating with your players to tell a shared story. And if that sounds complicated, it really doesn't have to be. In fact, I found a great shortcut to making players feel invested and reducing your own labor as a DM at the same time. Check out this video to learn how. Hey friends, Ginny D here, and
all right. Typical, very, very generic, very, very much within the 5th edition mindset of Dungeons and Dragons. Not really the rest of the way. Like I said, I'll put it to you this way. I don't see these problems in Call of Cthulhu, Traveler, Cyberpunk, Gamma World, Top Secret games. I just don't see them. And part of that is because that is a player base that does not have that, what's the word I'm looking for here? It doesn't have the 5th edition super sensitive player base that Dungeons and Dragons has. It has not attracted, nor has it pushed forward into that particular super sensitive mindset. And not to mention, I'd say that, at least as far as my experience is concerned, those are older player bases. I don't usually see 18-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 20-year-olds in those games. I see those games being played by people in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s. And just as a rule, if you got a 30-year-old man or a 40-year-old woman that's in your group, 9 times out of 10, they're going to be far more used to just having to deal with the fact that sometimes they're going to encounter uncomfortable things in the world. So you don't usually run into the same problems. Overall, though, like I said, good basic advice. I think there's definitely some color in the I have way more time to play this game than most, especially most older people will. It's a lot more prevalent, or a lot more useful advice rather, for your 18 or 17-year-old Dungeons and Dragons group, your 20-year-old Dungeons and Dragons group that's playing Saturday night or Friday night while they're in college, and they essentially have a part-time job, and instead of studying, they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. Not so much the I work full-time, I have a family, I have a very established life and schedule, and I have a very limited time. Not so much that, unless you stay focused heavily on the first 2, and particularly the first 1 of her tips. But overall, good content, good advice, not stuff that's unusable, plenty of good nuggets in there, and really nothing objectionable in terms of how she handles things. If you have that time, that third method is not a bad way to go about doing things. And it's a great way to put things together as long as you're careful with it. And I do think she's got a lot of, and this may be just her kind of playing to the demographic that she actually creates her content for, and what her viewer base happens to be. But I think she is a little bit overly sensitive about making characters feel like they're somehow being offended, and not necessarily like offended like I do something that morally or righteously bothers you as a person, but more along the lines of it's like, oh, my agency, I said that my brother went out to join the King's Guard, and it turns out he joined a cult instead. It's like, well, no, you were a little kid who thought your brother went to join the King's Guard, or you were a teenager who thought your twin brother went to join the King's Guard. Maybe because he lied to your parents about it. Maybe because he snuck off in the middle of the night, and that's just the rumor you heard that was wrong, because your backstory is just your perspective. You don't have, even in backstory, even in character backstory, a player does not have the ability to alter the world. They only have the ability to alter their character and how their character perceives events. So that's what I got to say. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you want me to react to more of Ginny D's content going down the line. And I will see you guys next time. Like, share, and subscribe.